Have you ever been upset, irrationally angry at all of the annoyances of common life on Earth? I'm sure you fantasized about getting back at whatever has upset you, but then you realize it's nothing more than a fantasy meant to quell your anger. Well, everything except the fantasy part is true of the show Dan vs. This Flash animated series was created by Dan Mandel and Chris Pearson. It aired on the Hub Network for 3 seasons before being silently cancelled. The show centers around a short, angry misanthrope named Dan and his pushover best friend named Chris. Yeah, I guess the creators named the characters after themselves. Anyways, the show focuses on Dan's plots of revenge against everything and everyone that does him injustice. I got introduced to the show because I wanted to watch R.L. Stine's The Haunting Hour on Hub, but it was coming on after an episode of Dan vs., so I sat through it and wound up liking it more than The Haunting Hour. In fact, Dan vs. turned out to be one of my personal favorite cartoons. But why is it that I love this series so much? Well, I'll try my best to express that through this review. Let's begin! The plot of every Dan vs. episode, as I said, involves Dan getting revenge on anyone who's wronged them. He's gotten revenge against his boss, who turned out to be a demon. He's gotten revenge against the entire country of Canada, and he even got revenge against George Washington long after he had already been dead. So, to give you guys an idea of how these episodes usually play out, we're going to go over Dan vs. Technology. We start off with Dan being dragged to the store against his will. In an effort to get Dan to leave them alone, Chris and Elise decide to get Dan a computer. Initially, Dan doesn't want one, but he's convinced pretty quickly when he's introduced to a cat video. It's nice for a while, until the computer breaks and Dan can't get a refund because the computer is obsolete.
How could it be obsolete? You sold it to me yesterday.
They're releasing the new platform this weekend. See?
Look how happy that dork is. Make this thing work like that thing.
Please come back when you're ready to upgrade, sir.
Technology!
What's that? Dan declares war against technology. Or rather, the man who made his computer obsolete, Barry Dittmer.
You can't stop technological progress, Dan.
People only say that because no one has tried.
After discussing a plan to drive to Silicon Valley and destroy Barry Dittmer, Dan and Chris leave. However, their entire conversation was recorded by Dan's broken computer, and his threat is sent to Barry. Barry decides to pay for some protection in the form of Elise, who, as it turns out, is actually a secret agent. That's the whole thing with this show, but I usually prefer to follow Dan's exploits. But anyways, Dan and Chris begin their trip to Silicon Valley, but get lost pretty quickly. While on the road, Chris decides to leave Elise a message telling him where he went.
Do you mind? I'm trying to leave a message.
Oh, just tell her you've left her. He's left you!
I didn't leave her. I haven't left you.
He's left you, and he's never coming back!
After crashing their car, Dan and Chris are left stranded in the woods where they meet some crazy guy named Hiram. Hiram almost murders them with an axe, but when Dan mentions how he wants to stop technology, Hiram takes a liking to them.
I hate technology too! Makes me all boing, boing, ding, ding. Finally, a kindred spirit!
Dan agrees to spend the night at Hiram's house while he fixes their car, even though Chris can tell that Hiram's insane. At Hiram's place, Dan wonders where the TV is, which gets Hiram to wonder if they really hate technology as much as he does.
I'm getting the feeling you don't hate technology as much as I do.
Probably not as much.
So that's how it is.
This leads Hiram to tell Dan and Chris a little story with puppets.
We'll call this puppet Dean. Oh, hang on. Something's missing. That's better. And here's Dean's big dumb friend. We'll call him Moose.
Just as an offhand note, I love how batshit insane Hiram is. This is supposed to be a children's network.
Oh no! What will become of us? Well, I'll be honest, I'm probably gonna cook and eat ya. But first, let's have a little fun.
Deciding to get out of there, Dan burns down Hiram's house and he and Chris escape.
I'll get you boys for this if it's the last thing I ever do. I promise you, you will pay.
That guy is so angry.
Meanwhile, Chris's wife figures out that Barry Dittmer is actually intending to mind control everyone with technology, but before she can stop him, she winds up under mind control herself. Back with Dan and Chris, they seem to have made a safe distance in their car, but they pretty quickly figure out that Hiram is still chasing them. Finally, the two arrive at Barry Dittmer's headquarters, but they're quickly hunted down by the mind-controlled Elise. Chris is knocked out, and when backed up into a corner with only a safety axe, Dan remembers a technique that Hiram told him about when it comes to throwing axes. With it, Dan tosses the axe right at Elise's head, luckily breaking the device but not harming Elise. Although Dan didn't seem to know that she was under mind control at all. With that, Dan and Elise head back to Barry to get their revenge. But before things can escalate too much, Hiram arrives. It turns out that Barry and Hiram knew each other before, but when Barry stole all of Hiram's ideas, he stayed away from technology and became an unstable cannibal. All hell breaks loose and the building begins to become unstable. Dan and Elise grab Chris and get out of there, while Barry and Hiram die in the fire. Dan declares victory over technology, and the episode ends. And that's about it for this episode, and that's basically how every episode goes down, with Dan usually on top, although sometimes he outright fails. Anyways, the concept of this show has led to some fun stories, even though there's no overarching story to any of all of this. Although Dan vs. the Telemarketer was actually a sequel to Dan vs. Dan, and there have been references to other episodes. So, for having a concept that constantly provides great episodes, I'll give the plot a high score. A good show has to have a good cast of characters you like to follow, so let's get into the cast of Dan vs. Dan is the main character of the series. He's ill-tempered and angry almost all the time, and he's my favorite character in the show. After following Dan long enough, you learn to love and enjoy his antics. Plus, most of the time, his anger is justified, and he's usually getting revenge against someone who's a bigger jerk than he is. Dan's pessimism is usually great for laughs as well. While certainly not a good person at all, Dan is still a very fun person to watch, and I think he was done very well. Chris is Dan's best friend, and he usually does what Dan says after a bit of arguing. Chris is pretty nice, and despite Dan being a jerk, Chris is still willing to help Dan out with getting his revenge. When paired with Dan, they're actually a pretty funny duo, and their banter is what drives most of the show's humor. He's certainly a better person than Dan, usually having moral problems with what Dan wants to do, and reasoning him down to do something less horrible. Finally, we have Elise. Elise is Chris's wife, and is secretly an agent. For me, the secret agent stuff is a bit out of place sometimes, and I usually prefer just watching Dan and Chris on their adventures. However, aside from that, Elise is pretty good. Unlike Chris, Elise usually doesn't put up with Dan's childish behavior, and doesn't let him use her. Something I noted is that Elise is actually fairly similar to Dan himself, and she's even spent episodes trying to get revenge on things. Aside from these three, there are no other main characters, although there are a few side characters that show up here and again. Anyways, these three characters do a pretty good job at carrying the show, and making it enjoyable to watch, so another high score for this show. Okay, so as you can all tell due to the limited music in this review, Dan vs. has a pretty limited soundtrack. The main theme usually just plays in the credits, and in the shows they usually just have short bursts of music whenever it's needed. Now, the music is pretty nice, and it represents the show pretty well, but nothing has ever stood out to me. It's not bad, but it's not that great either, so for my score I'll let it be somewhere in the middle, leaning a little bit towards the positive side since I do at least enjoy the bits of music that we get for a few seconds. Now, of course, comedy is subjective. What one person finds funny, another won't even bat an eye, so this is really just my opinion. I think this cartoon is one of the funniest out there. I'm a sucker for dark humor, and this series has a lot of dark jokes, if Dan vs. Technology didn't already prove that to you. Again, comedy is subjective, but I've found almost every episode of this show to be funny in some way, so for me, it works. This is a tricky one. To me, it's memorable, but actually Dan vs. is a pretty underrated show that not a lot of people have seen. But even fans of the show don't really talk about it that much. It's a show that kind of just came and went. I don't think I can give it any points for being memorable, since while I remember it, and I quite often quote it, a lot of people forget about it. In conclusion, Dan vs. is a highly underrated comedy that I wish would get more love. The characters are fun and the stories are creative. The dark humor is right up my alley, considering I have a sick, disgusting obsession with dark stuff. Maybe I should tone it down a bit. Dan vs. good! Check it out! Here's the score! I hope you enjoyed this review of Dan vs. More reviews and top 10s will come to you all in the future, so keep your eyes peeled like grapes. Bye bye!